Captain Mara Ellison sat quietly in the cockpit of the Hartwell, her patrol ship drifting low over the forest canopy of Varelia 9, a half-forgotten colony world that once promised prosperity, but had since become a place of quiet failure and dust-covered data logs. The world below her was thick with green, yet strangely lifeless, its automated terraforming stations decades old and no longer cared for. Mara was used to silence, to routine patrols, and to the ghost-like stillness of the outer colonies. But today something cracked that silence, a faint signal, weak and broken, blinking from the forest floor like a dying ember. Curious and cautious, she traced it to its source, landing her ship in a clearing dense with vines and overgrown stone. As she stepped outside, blaster holstered and scanner in hand, she spotted movement. Not an animal, not a threat, a figure. Thin, tired, alien. The being stood upright but swayed, its skin a pale ash-gray color with streaks of dull blue. Eyes large, heavy with exhaustion, met Mara's as the creature took a step forward and dropped to its knees in the dirt. Beside her, no, behind her, were 3 children, smaller and thinner still, their bones sharp under stretched skin, their silence louder than screams. The woman spoke slowly, her words thick with accent and pain. "I'll work your fields. Human, just feed my hungry children." Mara froze. She had seen refugees before, but never this far out. The Arvakan people were a scattered race, broken after the last interstellar conflict, once enemies of humanity, now mostly forgotten. But this one knelt before her, not as a threat, not as a soldier, but as a mother. Regulations were clear. No unauthorized beings could remain on colony soil without vetting, quarantine, and clearance. Protocol said she should call it in, wait for collection, and move on. But something in the woman's eyes, something ancient, fierce, and begging, cut through every protocol Mara had ever memorized. The woman collapsed forward, catching herself just before her face hit the ground. Her children didn't move, too weak to even cry. Mara moved quickly, scooping the woman into her arms while calling out a code-red Medicist to the Hartwell's onboard AI. She hesitated only a second before gesturing the children to follow, and though their legs wobbled and trembled, they obeyed. Once inside the ship, the AI protested and clipped polite alerts about biological contamination and unauthorized species, but Mara silenced it with a command override and set the ship to auto-launch. She laid the woman, Lura, the name whispered from trembling lips, on a medical bench and started scans. Malnutrition, internal strain, organ fatigue. The children were worse, but they were alive. Mara fed them small rations of nutrient paste, careful not to overwhelm their systems. As the ship climbed into orbit, Mara read through old conflict logs. The Arvakan were once known for their ability to shape worlds with their hands. Farmers, not just fighters. Terraformers whose instincts rivaled human tech. Lura had said she'd work the fields. But how had she even known Mara was stationed here? Why come to this planet of all places? Lura stirred, eyes fluttering open. Her voice cracked as she whispered again. "We followed the soil. It called to us. We had nothing left. My mate, gone. No ships would take us. We walked for days." Mara didn't understand at first. Soil doesn't call. Not to her. But maybe, to Lura, it did. She turned her attention to her ship's agricultural dome, an experimental project she had personally struggled with. Crops failing, soil chemistry collapsing, the entire system weeks away from shutdown. And now, in her care, a dying alien mother claimed she could fix it in exchange for food. The thought should have sounded absurd, but Lura's fingers curled into her palm like someone who once held earth that bloomed at her touch. Mara stayed, up that night reviewing old reports, digging into banned research and watching footage from the war. Arvakans walking through scorched fields, leaving green behind them. The woman's offer wasn't madness. It was memory. The next morning, she brought Lura to the dome. The woman stood unsteady, staring at the dirt with something like reverence. She knelt slowly, scooped up a handful of dry soil, sniffed it, rubbed it between her palms, and smiled faintly. "It sleeps," she said, "but it dreams still." Mara watched as Lura asked for water, carbon dust, and trace elements, ingredients, stored but unused. With trembling hands, Lura mixed them into the soil and sang. Not words, not any language Mara knew, but a hum, low and steady, a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the ground. She planted 5 seeds and whispered, "Give these to the hungry." Then she collapsed again. Mara didn't expect results. She was ready to call it mercy work. But 2 days later, when she returned to the dome, something had changed. The seeds had sprouted. Not just sprouted, but surged, rising in strong, vibrant stalks twice the height of normal growth. The soil's acidity had balanced. The carbon to nitrogen ratio had stabilized. Even the dome's oxygen output had increased. Mara ran the numbers twice, then 3 times. It didn't make sense, but it was real. She called in her mechanic, then her soil technician, both sworn to secrecy. No one could explain it, but everyone could see it. And outside the sealed med bay, Lura's children laughed softly for the first time. Cheeks no longer hollow, skin no longer gray. Yet Mara knew this couldn't stay hidden for long. Command would ask questions. They always did. She needed a plan, and fast. Because Lura had said something else as she drifted off into sleep that last time. Something that kept echoing in Mara's mind as she stared out into the stars. More are coming. Mara Ellison stood at the edge of the agricultural dome, staring at the tall green stalks that had no right to be alive, let alone thriving. Yet there they were, waving slightly under the dome's artificial breeze, their roots deep in soil that had been dying only days ago, now rich and dark and pulsing with life. She didn't understand it, not fully, but she knew it was real, and she knew it had something to do with the quiet alien woman now asleep in the ship's medical bay. Her children curled beside her like shadows returning to warmth after too long in the cold, and Mara, though trained as a patrol officer, not a scientist, not a diplomat, could feel something shifting in the bones of this forgotten world, something bigger than her orders, bigger than any report she could write, but not everyone would see it that way, and she knew she was already breaking rules by hiding Lura and her children here. Still, she couldn't stop now, not when there was proof growing out of the ground, so she brought in Evan Roque, the station's soil tech, swore him to secrecy, and led him to the test plot. He laughed when he saw it, not out of humor, but disbelief, falling silent as he touched the leaves and scanned the roots, then asked her what she had done, and Mara only said, "I let someone else try." And when he pressed, she told him enough to keep his curiosity alive and his voice low. Evan didn't report it, not yet, not with the soil samples telling him the impossible, that the chemical balance had repaired itself, microbial activity had exploded in days, and the yield projections now exceeded what they thought this dome could ever achieve. Mara watched him pace the lab, stunned, and finally she said, "If this can be done once, it can be done again." And Evan, ever the pragmatist, nodded and said they'd need more tests, more evidence, something to hold up when command started asking questions, because they would eventually notice a dying dome suddenly flourishing, and that kind of change didn't go unnoticed for long. Mara agreed, and over the next week, with Lura slowly recovering, they tested more patches, one with wheat, another with soy, and a small batch of tubers that had refused to grow for 2 years. And each time, with Lura guiding the process in her strange, wordless way, the crops not only grew, they thrived. It wasn't magic, Mara kept telling herself, even when it felt like it. And she watched Lura kneel in the dirt, fingers spread as if listening with her skin, her hums low and soft, rising and falling like she was speaking to the roots themselves. And the plants responded, visibly stronger within hours. And all the while, the children followed her, copying her motions, laughing again, playing in the fields like they belonged here, like they'd always belonged. But the success brought attention, and that meant trouble. Station Director Marcus Corbin had been watching the dome's numbers from afar, and he wasn't the kind of man to believe in quiet miracles or trust data without knowing exactly who was feeding it to him. So when he cornered Mara in the comms hall, arms folded, face cold, and said, "What exactly are you doing down there?" She lied, said the dome had recovered after adjustments, new techniques, routine maintenance, but his eyes narrowed. He didn't believe her, not fully, and she could feel it, the weight of suspicion crawling behind his calm voice. So she knew it was only a matter of time before he came down himself to see what she was hiding. That night she stood alone by the dome, watching the stars blink through the glass above, wondering what would happen if the truth came out, if Corbin saw Lura, if Command got involved, and she thought about what Lura had said after the third plot bloomed when Mara asked how she did it, and the alien woman had only whispered, "We remember the old ways. Your machines are loud, fast, but they do not ask the soil, they command it." And Mara had not known how to respond to that. But she believed it now, because nothing else explained what she was seeing. In secret, Evan brought in a trusted engineer, Linya Voss, who specialized in energy efficiency, and when she saw what the new crops were doing to the dome's oxygen recycling and power consumption, cutting both nearly in half, she turned pale and asked if they'd found some ancient tech or experimental strain, and when Mara told her the truth, she didn't laugh, just nodded slowly and said, "Then we protect her." And from that moment, the three of them formed a silent pact to shield Lura and her children from exposure, because they all knew what would happen if someone decided she was too valuable to be left alone, or worse, too dangerous to be allowed to live free. Still, time was slipping away and Corbin was circling closer. He sent down 2 assistants to inspect the dome under the excuse of routine checks, but Mara saw them taking pictures, whispering into wrist comms, scanning Lura from a distance. When they thought no one was looking, and when she confronted them, they played dumb. But she saw the fear in Lura's eyes, the way her arms instinctively wrapped around her children, the same way Mara had seen refugee mothers do on battlefield clearings, and it sparked something in her, something fierce and old, and she knew she wouldn't let these children be taken, no matter what orders came next. Yet the story was growing too big to stay secret, and when Lura told her, quietly, that she had seen others on the outer ranges, other Arvakans, just like her, wandering the broken fields and abandoned sites, drawn by the soil's soft call, its hunger for healing, Mara realized this wasn't a one-time miracle, but the beginning of something larger, a return, a reckoning maybe, and she didn't know if humanity was ready for it. But she knew one thing: they couldn't face the future by pushing away those who could save them. So she stood in the dome's center that night, hands in the earth, staring at the stars, and swore to herself that she would protect Lura and her children, not because it was allowed, but because it was right, even as Corbin drafted his report to Earth Command, requesting full oversight and bio-lockdown of the dome, and Mara, unaware of the message already en route, felt the faint tremble in the air, the first warning of a coming storm. The morning sky over Varelia 9 was pale orange when Mara received the message from Earth Command, a short but sharp directive that chilled her more than any winter wind. Prepare for inspection. All biological anomalies to be reported, no exceptions. She knew what it meant, even though the words were dressed in official calm. Someone had alerted them. Someone had betrayed the silence they had built around Lura and her children, and now time was running out. Mara paced the dome, her boots soft in the fresh soil, her mind racing as she watched Lura humming softly beside a new crop bed, her fingers brushing the young roots as if greeting old friends. The fields looked like something out of a dream, vibrant, glowing with life, a transformation so stunning it almost didn't feel real. Evan and Linya joined her moments later, both grim, both understanding that the hidden miracle was now in danger of being caged, dissected, or worse. "We can't keep this quiet anymore," Evan said in a low voice, glancing toward the dome's surveillance node. "But maybe we can control how the truth gets out." Linya, always the strategist, laid out the plan. If they could bring 3 domes online using Lura's methods before the inspection team arrived, they could present the results as a breakthrough collaboration, a shared human-alien success. not a secret violation. It was a risk, and a big one, but Mara agreed. They called it the Harvest Pact, a silent agreement between them. Protect Lura, expand the work, and prove the worth of cooperation before the bureaucrats arrived to claim everything. Over the next 10 days, the small team worked non-stop, flying to Dome 6 and Dome 2 in shifts, smuggling in samples of Lura's modified soil, and guiding the process with every ounce of care and secrecy they could muster. Lura insisted on going, herself, even when her legs still trembled from hunger not long forgotten. She spoke softly to each new bed of soil, teaching it as if it could learn, and to Mara's astonishment, it responded every time, plants sprouting stronger and faster than before, oxygen levels rising, energy draw dropping, and the artificial systems beginning to relax as nature reawakened. The children, too, began to change. They no longer looked hollow or afraid, but played between the green rows with laughter in their voices, their skin glowing with color and light. Mara started recording everything, not to use against Lura, but to save her, to build a case that no one could deny, that would show Earth Command something beyond protocol, hope, resilience, a new path forward. But as the domes flourished, so did the danger. Corbin grew impatient. He visited Dome 3 himself, and though the team distracted him with reports and false leads, he paused too long near a work table where a piece of Arvakan rootstone had been left by mistake, his fingers brushing the carved surface before Mara steered him away. That night he sent a coded message Mara couldn't intercept. The countdown had begun. Lura, sensing the tension, took Mara aside in the dark hours of morning and said quietly, "If they take me, they take everything. This is not mine alone, but it flows through me. The soil listens. It will not listen to machines." Mara wanted to promise her safety, but she couldn't, not with the inspection ship already in orbit, its arrival masked but visible in the upper atmosphere if you knew where to look. Evan and Linya redoubled their efforts, uploading data to off-grid storage, prepping the domes for presentation, while Mara made her final move. She sent a field test broadcast, a rarely used emergency override that allowed colony stations to stream live research across the entire human network, bypassing bureaucracy in the name of urgent discovery. It was a gamble, and if Earth Command shut it down quickly, it would be for nothing. But if even a few scientists or citizens saw what was happening here, maybe they would ask the right questions. The feed went live 12 hours before inspection, showing green waves of grain growing under Lura's hands, her children laughing in fields once dead, and Mara's calm voice explaining, "This is not about domination. It's about survival. We don't command this world. We ask it to grow." The message spread faster than expected. Comments flooded in, not from generals or directors, but from farmers, engineers, students, people who remembered what it meant to work with the land, and who saw Lura not as a threat but as a teacher. But Corbin was already moving. He stormed into Dome 3 with armed drones at his back, demanding the arrest of Lura and seizure of the dome under Article 17, biological threat containment. Mara stood between him and the vines, unarmed but unshaken. "You arrest her. You kill this planet," she said, voice firm. "The soil won't answer you." Corbin sneered, gesturing the drones forward. But before they reached her, something stopped them, roots coiling up from the earth, not attacking, but encircling the drones' legs, holding them in place without harm. The AI systems blinked red, confused. The machines froze. The soil had answered. More crew arrived, and to Corbin's shock, they didn't back him. They stood beside Mara, forming a wall of humans defending the alien who had saved them. Word of the broadcast had already reached parts of Earth Command, and while some called for immediate containment, others, those who saw the truth in the green, who remembered failing worlds, began to question. The inspection was delayed. A provisional order came down. "Stand by, do not detain the subject, further review in progress." It wasn't victory, but it was a breath of air in drowning water. That night, Lura sat in the dome's center, her children beside her, and Mara joined her on the soil, boots off, hands in the dirt. "You changed everything," Mara whispered. Lura shook her head. "No," she said. "You listened." And for the first time, the dome didn't feel like a station or a job. It felt like home, like the beginning of something new. But high above, the inspection ship still waited, and others were watching too, some curious, some afraid, and some who would not accept change so easily. The pact had been made, the fields had begun to speak, but the harvest, Mara knew, was still ahead. The inspection ship descended through the golden clouds like a silent predator, its shadow stretching long across Dome 3 as Mara watched from the control platform, her hands clenched and her thoughts racing. She had bought them time with the broadcast, yes, but it hadn't stopped the machine of command, only slowed its wheels. And now those wheels were rolling straight toward them, carrying officials who would decide whether Lura and her children would remain free or vanish into some hidden lab where no sun ever touched the ground. Lura, calm as always, stood barefoot at the center of the field, her palms turned down toward the earth, her hum barely audible but strong, and the crops around her, tall stalks of blue grain and thick-leafed beans, shifted as if breathing with her, and Mara wondered if the field really could feel what was coming, if it understood fear and defiance and the weight of choice. Evan and Linya had prepared data packets, analysis logs, oxygen and soil readings, even time-lapse growth footage, but deep down, all of them knew the inspectors would not be moved by numbers alone. They would want control, answers, certainty, and this place had never offered that. The shuttle touched down outside the dome an hour later, sleek and cold, and out stepped three figures in black and silver suits, faces unreadable behind mirrored visors, led by a woman named Director Hale, whose record Mara had studied and feared. She was known for efficiency, not compassion, and the kind of decisions that left no room for second chances. Mara met them at the entrance with a polite greeting, forcing her voice to stay steady, and led them through the winding paths of crops, each one healthier than it had ever been. The scent of fresh growth thick in the air, and still the visitors said nothing, scanning everything, recording everything, but giving nothing back. They stopped before Lura, who stood silently, her children at her side like small, watchful stars, and Hale said, "You are the anomaly," not as a question, but a fact, and Lura nodded once, unafraid, her eyes steady. Hale turned to Mara next and asked how the alien had altered the soil, how the crops were growing beyond projected models, how energy use had dropped by nearly 30%. Mara answered carefully, honestly, explaining Lura's methods not as magic, but memory, a deep-rooted way of listening that had been lost to human machines. And she showed the results, every chart, every test. But Hale remained silent, her mind working behind her unreadable visor. Finally, she asked if the alien had submitted to biological scans, and Mara said no, because Lura wasn't a subject or a specimen, she was a partner. And Hale's tone hardened as she replied that partnership required trust, and that command had no record of such a status being granted. Tensions rose as the children stepped back, their hands in the soil, their quiet murmurs joining their mothers, and the field around them stirred, literally stirred, stalks shivering though no wind passed, leaves rustling with a voice that seemed to rise from beneath the surface, low and soft and ancient, and everyone fell silent as the sound grew clearer, pulsing in rhythm like a heart. And then it spoke. Not in words exactly, but in memory, in feeling, something that passed through them all like a shared dream. Dust and ash, a world dying, a whisper asking for help, and then hands reaching into the dirt not to take but to heal. Hale staggered slightly, one hand on her helmet, eyes wide behind the glass, and her two aides froze in place, trembling as the soil beneath their boots shifted, not violently, not threateningly, just enough to remind them they stood on something, alive. Mara turned to Lura, eyes wide, and whispered, "Did you do this?" But Lura only shook her head and said, "No, it did," and that was when Mara understood. The field had learned not just from Lura, but from all of them, from weeks of quiet tending, shared breath, careful balance, and now it was trying to speak in return. Director Hale, recovering quickly, ordered a full scan of the area, but her voice shook slightly, and Mara saw the crack in her armor. The scanners whined and hummed, but the readings made no sense. energy patterns that fluctuated like brainwaves, soil chemistry behaving like a living system, and none of it fitting into command's models. Hale demanded containment, citing protocol, but the dome's systems began to respond to the field instead, airlocks refusing to seal, surveillance feeds going dark, lights dimming and brightening in patterns that echoed Lura's hums, and Hale stepped back, visibly shaken now, saying, "This is beyond control." And Mara answered, "Yes, but not beyond reason. It's asking you to listen." The children moved again, planting small crystals into the soil that pulsed with light, and new growth began before their eyes, tiny sprouts rising in seconds, reaching for the artificial sky like they had waited lifetimes to live. Hale turned to leave, snapping, "I'll report this." But Mara blocked her path and said, "Then report this too," and pointed to the far end of the dome where other figures were entering, colonists from Dome 6 and Dome 2, their faces full of wonder and questions, drawn by what they'd seen on the broadcast and by something deeper, older, that resonated in their bones. They weren't here to fight, or take, just to see, and they stood in silence as the field sang again, louder now, the language of root and rhythm and rebirth. Hale stared at them all, then at Lura, then back at the shifting, speaking earth, and said nothing as she turned and walked away, her ship lifting off without another word, and no official order ever followed. Just silence from command, as if they didn't know what to do with something they couldn't own. Weeks passed and the domes grew greener, fuller, joined by others who came not with machines but with questions, with open hands and listening hearts, and the field welcomed them all, growing more alive each day, responding not to rank or rules, but to care. Mara stood often with Lura at the center, watching the sky shift above, and one evening she asked, "Why did it speak now?" And Lura smiled and said, "Because it finally believed someone would hear it." And Mara knew she was right, that they were no longer just feeding a planet, they were being fed by it too, not with food alone, but with something far rarer: trust. The sun, or rather the artificial golden glow that passed for it, shone warmer than usual over Dome 3, and the air buzzed with quiet, hopeful energy as the fields stretched wide and green, filled with crops that shimmered with health no one had thought possible on this broken world. Mara walked slowly along the rows, her hand brushing against stalks that leaned ever so slightly toward her touch, as if recognizing the human who had stood up for them. And though weeks had passed since Director Hale's silent retreat, the weight of her presence still lingered like the last breath before a storm. No orders had come from Earth Command, no shutdown or extraction, just silence. And that silence was louder than words, because it meant decisions were being made behind walls they couldn't see, decisions that could still erase everything they'd built, and Mara knew they hadn't won yet, not truly, not until the fields were protected by more than secrecy and luck. Across the dome, Lura worked as always, her hands in the dirt, her children laughing nearby, their eyes brighter now, their skin glowing with the soft energy of full bellies and peace. And it amazed Mara how normal they seemed now, how easily they had fit into life here as if they'd always belonged. But others were arriving too, humans from other domes, from nearby colonies, even some from passing cargo ships, drawn by the strange stories whispered through back channels, by the footage of talking soil and impossible harvests. And many came, skeptically, thinking it a trick, a hallucination. But they stayed when they saw it with their own eyes, stayed when the soil under their feet hummed gently as if greeting them. And soon it wasn't just a miracle in one dome. It was the beginning of something bigger. Evan and Linya had already helped transplant the method into Domes 6 and 2, and those fields now sang too, not with voices, but with life that couldn't be faked. Wheat that resisted rot, berries that grew twice the size with half the water, roots that cleansed the ground as they spread, and everyone who touched the soil began to understand. This was not a technology to be patented or sold. It was a relationship, a living system that required respect, not control. But not everyone saw it that way. One morning, a crew of engineers from Dome 14 arrived with machines, scanning drones, soil samplers, and coded orders to map and replicate the anomaly. And when Mara confronted them, their leader, a sharp-eyed Man named Rask simply shrugged and said, "If it grows, it can be copied," and began pushing equipment into the outer rows. Lura stepped forward then, not angry, just sad, and said quietly, "You cannot own this by force. It will not bloom for those who take." And Rask laughed, until the machines began to fail, their data scrambled, their tools jamming with unexpected resistance, and the plants around them drooped, not from harm, but as if disappointed, withdrawing their energy like a tide pulling back. The engineers left the next day, frustrated and confused, and Mara logged everything, filing a quiet report to the network of sympathetic scientists who now watched from afar, waiting, hoping for change. More domes began to experiment carefully, guided by Lura's soft instruction and the whispered rhythms of the fields, and those who came with open hearts found success, while those who tried to dominate found only silence. Eventually, the silence from Earth Command broke, not in the way anyone expected, but through an unauthorized message slipped through the colony net. A simple sentence from an anonymous official. "You may have started something we can't stop. Be careful who hears it next." It was both warning and acknowledgement, and it filled Mara with dread and hope all at once. Still, she pressed forward, organizing open forums, sharing results, encouraging a growing alliance of domes to document their growth, protect their data, and most of all, protect Lura and her children, who had become both symbols and secrets, too precious to hide yet too dangerous to expose fully. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the dome lights softened to twilight, a young girl from Dome 5 arrived with her father, both thin and quiet, clearly tired from a long journey, and the girl walked straight to Lura without fear, knelt beside her and placed a seed in the dirt, saying only, "Please." Lura smiled and sang a soft note, and within moments the soil responded, green pushing through the brown, leaves unfurling like wings, and the girl gasped, eyes wide with wonder. Others saw, others believed, and the story grew. One dome, then 5, then 12, all learning to ask instead of demand, to plant with hands and hope, not machines and greed. And as the planet changed, so too did the people, learning to live with less waste, to work with patience, to see their homes not as machines to be maintained, but as gardens to be tended. But the threat still loomed, far above, in orbit, silent. Ships waited, perhaps ready to shut it all down if ordered, and spies moved quietly through the network, trying to find the source of the change, the trick behind the miracle, never believing that there was no trick, only trust. One night, as Mara stood alone in the field, she heard the soil again, not in sound, but in memory, a warmth rising through her feet into her chest, a feeling like being held by something vast and old, and she knew the field was speaking once, more, not just to her, but to anyone who would listen, sending its message through roots, through leaves, through the very air. "Share me, but do not steal me." The next day, Mara began writing a guide, not a manual, but a story, one that explained the path they had walked, the choices they had made, the trust they had built, and she titled it Fields for All, and released it freely across every colony. Every ship, every station, with a simple message at the end: ask and you will grow, take and you will lose. Within weeks, new growth was seen even in the harshest domes, in places once given up for dead, and the quiet hum of the living field spread like a song across the stars, not loud, not fast, but certain, because the soil remembered who had fed it, and it was ready to feed them all in return.